Namaste. Sri Gurubhyo Namaha. I welcome you all to the second Pujya Swami Dayananda Saraswati Memorial Lecture. We have instituted this lecture in memory of Sri Pujya Swamiji last year, and we had our first lecture delivered by Sri Ram Madhav Ji, General Secretary, Bharatiya Janata Party, and founder of India Foundation. This year, we have Sri Gurumurthy Ji, who will deliver the memorial lecture. The program will be, I will speak about Indic Academy and my association with Pujya Swamiji for about few minutes. Then I'll request Sri Gurumurthy Ji to deliver his lecture, and then we will have a 10-minute Q&A. Indic Academy is a non-traditional university for traditional knowledge. We have established ourselves in 2015. We seek to bring about a global renaissance of Indic civilizational thought. We seek to preserve, protect, and promote Indic civilizational thought. We do this across the intellectual, cultural, and spiritual spectrum. And we have what we call as a 3-horizon framework. We look at things from a near term, medium term, and long term. We have a multi-dimensional strategy, and we seek to build centers of excellence. We seek to transform intellectuals, and we build an ecosystem. Our centers of excellence currently are Inter Gurukula University Center. What we are trying to do here is to bridge the gap between the Gurukula system and the contemporary education. We are seeking Shastras, Indic knowledge systems, and Indology. Over the last 2 years, we have done several initiatives under this center, and we have now examining the establishment of a Mahagurukulam in Hyderabad, along with the Liberal Arts University. We have another center, Center for Soft Power, and this center seeks to preserve and promote Indian culture to the global audiences. We have established this 2 years ago, and this is headed by Sri Vijayalakshmi Vijay Kumar. In this center, we run a digital platform called Soft Power Mag, and we also conduct events, seminars. Recently, we have conducted a festival for a month-long celebrating our festival, our soft power. And we had more than 112 speakers from various countries. We now recently established a Center for Indigenous Sustainability and Indigenous Environmentalism. This center is headed by Viva Kermani and Rahul Goswami. Here we're trying to focus on crafts, Ayurveda, and regenerative agriculture. Apart from these 3 centers, we seek to transform intellectuals by conducting courses. We are offering research fellowships. We conduct events. We also publish, and we have also incubated 7 platforms. We are also building an active ecosystem. We are building the infrastructure of the ecosystem by providing grants to various organizations. We also have specialist networks, and we also have actively promoting collaborations with multiple universities. This is the broad strategy that we are following. Over the last 5 years, we have established ourselves as a very unique organization doing all these activities. We have emerged as the largest grant-giving organization. We have emerged as an organization which is conducting unique events. We have conducted events which have not been thought of before, which are very unique in their construct. We are publishing several books, which again have made a mark. And our entire focus is to be unconventional because we are focused on the traditional knowledge. We want to approach it in a non-traditional way. Specifically, my association, my personal association with Pujya Swami Dayananda Saraswati started in 2010 when I set up Advaita Academy to promote Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, and I approached him. Advaita Academy in the last 10 years has more than 45 gurus, teachers, academics, and we have more than 9,000 videos. Our aim in Advaita Academy is to establish the traditional teaching which Swamiji has started way back in Rishikesh several decades ago. And we want to continue that tradition by establishing four more traditional forms of traditional unfolding of Advaita Vedanta across the world. What Swamiji has done in Sailorsburg, in Nagpur, in Anekati and Rishikesh, we want to do the same thing in other parts of the world. This is the, we have the blessings from Pujya Swamiji for this. For a long time, I requested him to bless me, saying that the world needs more teachers, more authentic teachers, because what has happened is that we have several spiritual gurus who don't link their teachings with the traditional knowledge, and who sort of promote it independently without linkage. The consequences of that is that over a period of time, these spiritual teachings lose their meaning, and it becomes very frivolous. So it is very important. We believe it's very important that we need to produce more Swamijis and Swaminis who are trained in the traditional Advaita Vedanta and unfolding of traditional Advaita Vedanta. So this is our belief. We have the blessings for Swamiji, and we have last year announced that we will be establishing the first one with Swami Atma Prakashananda in London. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we could not do it, but we hope to start this in post-COVID scenario. We are also looking at establishing a Yogacharya program, which is again focused on trying to produce. We have number of 500-hour teachers, we have 200-hour teachers, we have asana practices that are happening, asana teachers are being produced. But what we believe is that the time has come for us to produce Yogacharyas. The focus would be on not just asana, but you take it to the next level. And that is what we are trying to do in terms of another program that we want to launch. The third thing is executive coaching. World over, executive coaching is very big. And unfortunately, the same thing, all the coaching is, all the coaches would take wisdom from our scriptures, but they don't acknowledge. There is a need for us to produce a course for executive coaching, which is authentic and which does not shy away from quoting the scriptures. So these are the three activities that we are proposing to do. Apart from that, we have also taken up a sankalpam to establish 108 Adi Shankaracharya vigrahas around the world. We have already initiated this. We have installed 6 vigrahas so far. And we are also trying to follow the route that Adi Shankaracharya has taken across the country and see where all there are no vigrahas, and we would like to institute so that there is a mark of trail there. So these are the activities that Indic Academy and Advaita Academy are undertaking, and we are guided by the spirit of Pujya Swamiji is there with us. I met him on the 19th of September when he flew down from America. I met him in Rishikesh, and he has blessed, and his last words to me personally were, "Work hard, Bharat ke liye." So these were the words, these were the blessings, and these are the blessings that guide us in all that we do. I now welcome Sri Gurumurthy Ji. Gurumurthy Ji, I had the opportunity and pleasure to work with for almost 25 years now, one of the finest legal and corporate and strategic thinkers of our times. I'll just read out, most of you already know about him. I'll just read out a few lines about him. Swaminathan Gurumurthy, popularly known as writer and journalist in India and a chartered accountant by profession, is a corporate advisor of high standing. Highly rated for his investigative writings, he has ceaselessly campaigned against corruption at high places, exposing the bribery in the Bofors arm deal and the nexus between corporates and the government. A beleaguered government arrested Gurumurthy and persecuted Gurumurthy, but faced humiliation with the entire media standing by him. The issues raised by Gurumurthy became election issues, which led to the defeat of the most powerful government since independence. Hamish MacDonald, a well-known Australian journalist, wrote in his book, Polyester Baron, that Gurumurthy's investigative work must rank amongst the most powerful examples of investigative journalism anywhere in the world. He was rated among the 50 most powerful persons in India in 1990, 8th most powerful and 70th most powerful today. As he has, on the advice of the great sages of Shankaracharya Chandrasekhar Saraswati of Kanchi Kamakodi Peetham, he has kept away from all positions of power offered to him by different governments, corporates, and other institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, I have extreme pleasure, honor inviting Sri Gurumurthy Ji. I really am thankful to him for accepting this. He has been a long-term associate of Pujya Swamiji, and he has worked very closely with Pujya Swamiji. And he will share with us his experiences and his learnings and the impact Pujya Swamiji has had on our society. Please welcome.
Namaskar, Kiran. I am delighted to speak today, not only on Swami Dayananda Saraswati, from whom my learning started on various subjects which I wouldn't have touched in my life, but for my association with him. It's destiny that brings you in touch with certain people. And that's how I would regard my association with Swami Dayananda Saraswati. You know, I have been in a different field, though my intense liking for Indian spiritualism, nationalism, culture, nation had always kept me in the realm of the ancient Indian continuity into contemporary India. So it is in this context that we organized one Dharma Rakshana Samiti conference in Chennai in the context of huge efforts for conversion, which was taking place in Tamil Nadu for a long time, and it has been a feature of all India also. And till then, we had always thought that Swami Dayananda Saraswati was more concerned about Vedanta and strict and pure spiritualism. But thanks to the efforts of Dr. Padma Subramaniam, who had very close association with Swamiji, we could invite Swamiji to participate in the conference, which was held in 1999. It was a very unique conference. We had some 45 days preparations. And each one of them who participated in the conference was chosen to participate with an entry fee. And nearly 1,000 people participated for a whole day, in which Cho Ramaswamy, Arun Sholi, all participated, and a galaxy of spiritual leaders also participated, in which Swamiji in one sentence captured what is the problem. He said, conversion is violence. I mean, in these 3 words, he encapsulated what we have been struggling to say in volumes of books. Conversion itself is violence, because you cause such huge mental trauma, not only to the converted, but also to the society from which the conversion takes place. And with those three words, Swamiji exploded into the Vedanta of cultural nationalism of India. That was Swamiji's transformation from Vedanta to Vedantic cultural nationalism. And from then onwards, a different Swami, Dayananda Saraswati, emerged on the horizon in India and outside to his audience and other audiences. And it was a magnificent period afterwards as to how he expounded an ancient concept in the modern context in a manner in which nobody would refuse to listen, refuse to accept, and no one could counter because of his extraordinary brilliance. He was a master teacher and master of words. And so the blessings he had from Goddess Saraswati manifested in his manifold efforts, activities, formulations, expositions, in which I had the opportunity of participating. In 1999, this Dharmarakshana Samiti meet, he transformed from Dharma to Hindu Dharma. He said the foundation of Dharma is the Hindu philosophy, Hindu people, and it extended into the Hindu nation. And Dharmarakshana Samiti evolved into Hindu Dharma Acharya Sabha, which was his greatest contribution to Hindu Dharma. Hindu Dharma or Hindu nation or Hindu society or Hindu philosophy can never be Vaticanized. You can never have one leader, you can never have one approach, because it is many in the form of one, and one representing many. So it's something unbelievably diverse. If you put India and Hinduism on the one side and the rest of the world on the other, you will see more diversity here than the rest of the world put together. How to give a name, form, definition to it? So he devised the Hindu Dharma Acharya Sabha, where he kept all the acharyas on the pedestal, and he himself sat in a well to tell them, you are the master, I am the exponent of this under your blessings. And this became the only representative forum for the Hindu society, which never had a representation at the global level. This is today recognized as the representative at the United Nations and other multi-national fora on spiritualism and religion. This is his single greatest contribution. The way he did it was marvelous. He went and met every acharya, sometimes waited to see them. And his humility manifested in the way he worked to bring about this conference. And this extended into 2 or 3 initiatives. Even earlier in the year 2000, he had organized the World Conference for Preservation of Religious Diversity, which was the immediate manifestation of his formulation, conversion is violence, because the ancient societies were the ones which were devastated and destroyed by conversion. Religious diversity was emaciated by conversion. So he brought together all the ancient societies to say that the world had this kind of religious diversity. As many diverse groups constituted that many religions, that many ways of worship, that many approaches, that many courses of spiritual development. And he continued this effort and brought Hindu philosophy on a geopolitical platform, a geo-religious and geo-cultural and geopolitical platform, by first organizing the Hindu-Jewish conversion conference. You know, in fact, Jewish religion has a very specific mandate not to deal with idolaters, not to do business with them. And Swami Dayananda Saraswati so beautifully expounded the concept of Hindu philosophy, saying that these outward manifestations were merely efforts to graduate a person to a level of one unmanifested, unseen God, and that is Brahma. So he made all the idols, which were the objects of objection to the Jewish religion, merely an appearance. And that resulted in an agreement being signed later as to how these two religions are aligned, how they can work not only philosophically, religiously, culturally, and even politically. This had an extraordinary impact on even Indo-Israel relationships. And then in the year 2008 is one of the finest contributions, which is not yet seen in the public domain except for the Prime Minister of India in the year 2016, if I remember right, spoke about it when certain Kerala nuns were given sainthood. There he recalled Swami Dayananda Saraswati's contribution in the year 2008 on the occasion of the Declaration of Human Rights from religious perspective. On the 60th anniversary, all the religious leaders met at The Hague, with Swami Dayananda Saraswati participating. It was done through Global Foundation for Civilizational Harmony, in the opening of which Swami Dayananda Saraswati participated with the galaxy of spiritual leaders participating from all religions, from Christianity, from Hinduism, from Islam, from Sikhism, from Jainism, from Jewish religion. And it was declared open by Dalai Lama, and the chief guest was Abdul Kalam. It was a galaxy of such masters, in which Swami Dayananda Saraswati took the lead role and formulated the GFCH, which supported Swami Dayananda Saraswati's efforts in the 2008 conference, in which he virtually incorporated his 1999 formulation that conversion is violence into an acceptable model for which all religions joined to sign, where there were three propositions he made clear: that everyone has a right to be in the religion of his birth, and no one should be converted by force or by inducement, and religion should live in harmony. This is essentially a Hindu philosophical viewpoint. All the religious leaders accepted it. Professor Vaidyanathan, who assisted in this, he went 2 days ahead and socialized with them, and he expounded what is inducement. When it was asked if distributing a Bible is inducement, Vaidyanathan said, distributing a Bible is not inducement, but if you keep a $100 note inside the Bible, it is inducement. So the whole thing became so clear, they all accepted that's wrong. And then Swami Dayananda Saraswati continued his geopolitical, geocultural, geo-religious, and geopolitical efforts. Political in the sense of international understanding, not in the sense of sectional politics. And laid the foundation and constructed the models for expounding the spiritual values underlying Hindu nationalism. Hindu nationalism is not a political idea. It is a spiritual idea. Swamiji expounded the spiritual values underlying and turned the spiritual discourse, pure spiritual discourse, into Hindu nationalist spiritual discourse. We have to go back a little as to how this spiritual perspective of nationalism was lost in the Indian discourse, particularly in the post-Indian discourse. If you look back, all these great leaders, of course, Swami Vivekananda and Aurobindo are a class apart. They belong to a different realm. But Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Rajni Palme Dutt, a communist who formed, Indian communist who formed the Communist Party in England, will you believe they all spoke of Hindu nationalism? That's what I'm going to tell now. Of course, Swami Vivekananda expounded the idea of Hindu nationalism, Hindu spiritual nationalism associated with the land of India, with its philosophy, with its culture, with its values, with its tradition, and brought out the geopolitical, geocultural, and nationalistic character of India. And then Aurobindo, in 1909, in his Uttarpara speech, equated Indian nationalism to Hindu nationalism and to Sanatana Dharma. He said, India will live only so long as Hindu nationalism and Sanatana Dharma lives. If they are capable of perishing, India will perish. That is how he equated the very purpose of India, the very life of India, the very sustaining force of India to Sanatana Dharma and Hindu nationalism. This is 1909. At the same time, Mahatma Gandhi writes his Hind Swaraj, the dialogue, the imaginary dialogue between the editor and the reader, where Mahatma Gandhi is the editor and he is the reader also. The reader keeps asking questions. One of the finest document, critique of Western civilization, each one of the points raised by Mahatma Gandhi is proving to be true in contemporary world. But because we are caught in the mesmeric influence of the materialist order, we are not able to see beyond this to understand, but it is all coming out explicitly. And a specific question Mahatma Gandhi puts to himself through the reader, that what is it? It is only the Britisher who brought together the so-called India through post office and railways. How do you call yourself a nation or a country? It is the Britisher who made it. Gandhi replies, this is a complete misconstruction. You know, our religion says that we can worship God at home. We can worship God within. But our forefathers established these Char Dhams. The Rameshwaram in the south, the Puri in the east, and centers in the north, and made millions of people move from one end of the country to the other. And they felt one in a manner in which no two Englishmen can be, and gave a sense of unity. And he said everyone thought of having a pot of Ganges in their home. And the reader asks another question. Mr. Gandhi, it will only mean Hindus. What about Muslims? He said the intervention of another religion does not change the character of a country. It must assimilate them. This was Gandhi's response. Today, if you say that, it will be called communal, it will be called majoritarian. But this was the formula of Gandhi. And Gandhi said in 1940 that I have reread several times what I wrote in 1909, and I don't need to change a comma or full stop on this. And in 1935, Jawaharlal Nehru writes The Glimpses of World History, in which he says, you cannot really draw a line between Hindu nationalism and Indian nationalism because India is the only land of Hindus. And he goes a step further and says, Swami Vivekananda expounded the concept of Hindu nationalism. And there is nothing anti-anybody in that. So he accepted the concept of Hindu nationalism in 1935 as opposing none. And in 1939, Rajani Palme Dutt wrote his India Today. At that time, the title of the book was India Today. At that time, the British had a huge campaign that you fellows did not know what is freedom. It is our English education which gave you a sense of freedom and sense of identity as a nation. And it is our education which has made you fight against us for freedom. Rajani Palme Dutt counters it in diverse ways. The most important thing is his formulation that even if we had not learnt English, we would have got the spirit of freedom from the philosophy and teachings in our isolated Veda Padashalas. This was the position of diverse streams of thoughts and leaders in India till 1939. In 1940, Jinnah passes the resolution for partition of Pakistan in Lahore. All drop the idea of Hindu. Hindu becomes an orphan. Hindu philosophy becomes untouchable. And with this idea that we could avoid partition. We could not avoid partition, and Hindu India became orphan in post-independent India. How much of an orphan, how much of a hated orphan it is? The first Prime Minister of India said, Hindu nationalism is worse than and more dangerous than Muslim nationalism, even though it is more aggressive. This was the formulation for independent India's approach to different religions. This defined the fundamentals of secularism in India. Hinduism was under stress. It is many people even, as late as in 2009, when I met a Hindu spiritual leader, he said, no, we have to drop the word Hindu, it is not going to help us. This was the extent of impact that the post-independent secular order created in the mind of the Hindu spiritual leaders, Hindu people, Hindu society. And this evolves into a huge responsive Ram Janmabhoomi movement, which acts as a corrective to this massive distortion and perversion of national mind. And it brings about a total change. And the Supreme Court delivers a judgment in the year 1996 that Hindutva or Hinduism or Hinduness is not narrow-minded. It represents the Indian culture, Indian civilization, and Indian ethos. Constitutionalization of Hindu spiritualism, Hindu cultural nationalism happened after massive protest against this extreme perversion of the Indian mind through this concept of perverted secularism, which was expounded immediately after partition. And this became the foundation on which the Indian mind began building up. The most critical part of it is what Karl Popper said as the paradox of tolerance. We began equating a tolerant philosophy with an intolerant ideology. In India, there is no ideology at all. Everything is philosophy. Philosophy means that you have a view and you concede that the other person will have another view. This is philosophy, darshanas, Shad darshanas, in which three of them even deny the existence of a defined God. That is called Nirishwar. So, our darshanas themselves said self is God. There is no God independent of the self. So we had a dialogue, and the dialogue avoided any kind of skirmishes, violence, fights on the street. So this spirit of tolerance was developed by dialogue for thousands of years. Adi Shankara Mandala Mishra dialogue is a very important exposition, example, illustration of this culture of dialogue, where if you get angry, you are supposed to be defeated. That was the level to which we had taken dialogue to be. And against this, there are intolerant philosophies, intolerant ideologies. Ideology presumes what I say is right, what the other person says is wrong. There is no question of dialogue. There is no place for dialogue. This created a conflict between tolerant philosophies and intolerant ideologies. Karl Popper summarized it beautifully, that there is paradox of tolerance when the tolerant has to accept the intolerant, and in the process the intolerant will destroy the tolerant. So we may have to contain the intolerant in the interest of the tolerant. This is formulated in 1945. But nobody took notice of it because the liberal world was obsessed with this liberalism so much. It never understood that there could be intolerant ideas, ideologies, thoughts, peoples, institutions, religions, politics, which tolerant philosophies, tolerant ideas, tolerant institutions cannot digest. They never understood it. Of course, it came in a big way in 2001 when it hit America. Then they understood that intolerance is something which cannot be tolerated. This is what Ram Janmabhoomi movement brought about. So this idea, paradox of tolerance, was a problem in India, and this manifested, this was rooted in India's ambivalence to war and power. This is a 2000-year ambivalence. This ambivalence commenced with the confusion of Ashoka. You compare, Ashoka became the embodiment of post-independent, not only post-independent India. Post-Mauryan India also inherited the model of Ashoka. But it was a perversion and lack of proper understanding of Ashoka himself. I will go into it later. So much so, when Chanakya said that, you have to be prepared for war, you need a regular army, and no state can be without an army to face a violent invader, Kadambari Bana condemned him as an adharmi, and Chanakya's literature disappeared in the country. One book was saved in Mysore. That was the extent of objection to a person who said you may have to have violence to resist violence. That is the extent to which the Indian mind was ambivalent about war and power. Why this came? You look at Arjuna's state of mind before the Kurukshetra war. It is exactly the same Ashoka's state of mind after the Kalinga war. Whatever Ashoka said after the Kalinga war, Arjuna said before the Kurukshetra war. Ashoka said, I have killed so many people, I have made so many orphans, I am a sinner. And he gave the war. Arjuna refused to wage the war because of these very reasons. But Krishna educated him through his long discourse and said, a rare war is inevitable, you please understand it. He was not promoting war. And then finally tells Arjuna in the 63rd chapter, after carrying him through so many perspectives of life. Itite jnanamahyadam guhyadam maya vimarshayeta tadeshena yatechasi tata. I have explained to you everything. It is now for you to choose whether to wage the war or not. You see, there is no mandate even at that time. But Arjuna chooses to wage the war because he gets clarity that sometimes a war is inevitable. But when Ashoka gave up the war, he was celebrated for giving up the war. But if Ashoka had lost the Kalinga war and given up the war, he would never have been a hero. It is the winner Ashoka who made the decision to give up the war respectable and himself a hero. But India somehow lost the sense of having to be victorious. And India, which never felt that it must be always be ready for a war, and no one should think of conquering us, we will not conquer anyone. This is the sense of Ayodhya. Ayodhya is no war, but no one should think of a war against us. That was India's strategic policy. But post Ashoka, there was a massive perversion. With the result, we thought not waging a war, not having an army is non-violence. This influenced the freedom movement. And when it became so much a problem that when the first Prime Minister took over and the British commander came and asked him, what is our military policy? He said, military? We don't need a military. Police is sufficient for us. Of course, within 3 months, he needed a military to fight the Pakistani Rangers who had come. So, even then the mindset was the Ashokan mindset, not the victorious Ashokan mindset. Ashoka minus victory became the model for India. And in 1962, we faced a devastating destruction. We lost over 3,000 soldiers. We lost 45,000 square kilometers of our territory and national honor, which made us understand how wrong we were in not being prepared for war. This shook India. It called into question our ambivalence to power. Then we began building power. Power is not built overnight. And in 1971 we won, and the first kind of atomic explosion we made in 1974. And the Ram Janmabhoomi movement evolved into a very powerful nationalist movement. And in 1998, change of government took place. And that is where the first major step takes place. India explodes the Pokhran atom bomb. You know what is the consequence of it? This is so beautifully written by one advertisement specialist. She said that I used to travel across the world by profession. Whenever I used to stay in the houses of Indian friends and relatives abroad, they used to abuse India as a rotten country, as corrupt, see the traffic, see the dirt. Once the Pokhran atom bomb was exploded, everything changed. India, everything they complained against India remained the same. But the pride of India was aroused with the result. When nobody would put $1 on India, the non-resident Indians contributed $6 billion for the India development bonds. This is the transformation of the Indian spirit. And India became a player at the global level. Nobody bothered about India. In fact, Clinton said when India exploded the atom bomb, the land of Buddha and Gandhi has done this. We were always the land of Buddha and Gandhi. Did you ever look at us? Only the sound of the atom bomb made the world realize, because it is World is ruled by powerful rogues. And the balance of power is the theory by which they were ruling the world. Those who do not have power have no role in the world. This was the post-Cold War formulation of the global order, which is now changing, as they say. I will go to it a little later. But the fact remains that India did not count in the world of power because India did not choose to be a player. Pokhran atom bomb made India a player. And we have come far away from that. We are a global power player. I will cite only two examples. That India's position is now rising is clear from one change in the global discourse. You know, this Asia-Pacific concept has changed into Indo-Pacific concept in the global discourse. Because India is now a power to defend global interest in Indian and Pacific Ocean. We could never have achieved abrogation of Article 370, but for our global power. We could not have done many transformations, including the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, without national power echoing in global arena. So, India is now an emerging global power, and the message is very clear that we will never conquer, and we will never allow anyone to conquer us. This is the concept of Ayodhya, which manifested in India emerging as a global player and as global power. Now, the world is changing. The post-COVID world order will change the existing world order forever. Everybody says this, even the very person who formulated the Cold War order said world order will change forever, Henry Kissinger. And no one knows what the future order will be. The existing order, which replaced the ideological order till the Cold War. The Cold War order was an ideological order of conflict between democratic and free economic societies versus the autocratic and communist economic societies. In this we did not figure, but China's defection from the socialist camp to America was necessitated by China's failing economy, in which they nearly lost about 40 million people in the space of 3 years in the Great China Famine. And that made China feel that we cannot live with communism, we have to transform. So they became a market economy with the Marxist state. But we continue to be a socialist economy in a democratic state. So there were a mismatch. The world preferred China because the world wanted to invest in a stable society in dictatorship, because the post-Cold War order wanted China as the Western ally. And also the West found it is good to invest in an autocratic society because there will be no problem, there will be stability. No, this is the kind of thought which gave preference to China. And China has now emerged as the biggest threat to the free world. You know, this is not something which happened during COVID, or it is going to happen after COVID. Even before COVID, this was manifest because in the year 2017, the US trade representative and EU trade representative both submitted reports to their respective government that we cannot work the WTO, which is the global free market, with a non-transparent China. You always knew China was non-transparent, but you brought China into it because it helped you. But 2008 financial crisis changed the whole thing. by making real economy stronger than the financial economy, when the rest thought it could control the real economy through the financial economy. Its whole assumption failed in 2008, and the entire power of China was built between 2008 and 2019. So now, in this period, they filed an application in WTO saying China is not a market economy. Everyone knew it. China said, the moment you admitted me in WTO, I have become a market economy. This distortion was brought about by the West, whose multinational companies thought that they can keep China as a dirty factory to make profit everywhere in the world. This landed the world in such difficulty. There is a huge problem for the democratic societies today. That's where I think the turn of India, the role of India, the power of India, and the future of India is going to be. That's what I'm going to explain to you. In 2019 January, the Foreign Policy magazine brought out a very profound document, Democracy and Disorder, in which they said liberal democracies are under stress and are failing. In Central and Eastern Europe, liberal democracy not only may fail, they may become autocratic societies. You know, the liberal democracy means only 14% of the world's population. India added, they will never accept India as a liberal democracy. India added, it becomes 31% of world's population. If all kinds of democracies where elections are held, it becomes 46% of world's population. 54% of the world's population is under autocracy. So, Foreign Policy magazine said that India is the only silver lining or golden lining of democracy, because without that the world of democracy will not survive. And it did not go into specifics, but I am going to specifics because the Western liberal democracies are failing because of liberalism itself. It has given so much role for individuals without they can live without regard to family, they can live without regard to society, community, even state. With the result, the average voting in liberal democracies has come down from 95% to almost 62-63% today. The American democracy is struggling to cross 50%. And youths are not voting, only 40% of the youths are voting. Only educated people, people with high income, people with high education, they are majority voters. The minorities do not vote. The poor people do not vote. So it is an elite top-down democracy, which has no relevance to how ordinary people think in liberal democracy. I am not talking about other democracy. Look at India. 75% of the minorities vote. 66-67% of the scheduled caste and OBCs vote. It is the forward caste, it is the educated people, it is the high income people who vote less. So you can understand our democracy is bottom spread, stable democracy. That is how an illiterate India could outvote a dictatorship in 1977. The world did not properly take note of how strong the sense of democracy in India is, because India had deliberative democracy for 5,000 years. We had even a representative democracy, which the constitution recognized and brought in the Panchayati Raj in 1990s. And we have the largest democratic representatives in the world. Almost 2.8 lakh representatives elected. This is something, a huge difference it makes. And now the entire world is seeing if not a Cold War, a division between the democratic societies, democratic nations, and autocratic nations, in which India will emerge as the fulcrum. That is the most important thing, because we are the most stable democracy. We may have an unstable government. We had unstable governments between 1989 till 2014. We had stable to rickety coalitions. But after 2014, things have changed. India is now mature enough to understand the need for a stable government. And so it is electing stable governments, which no democracy in the in Germany, they are not able to elect one party majority. Everywhere this problem is there. But India is able to solve the problem. This has made foreign policy recognize that there is something in this civilization. What is in this civilization? I was asked a question in 2014 when I addressed a conference in Japan about democratic values in Asia. You know, it was a seminar in which the moderator puts the questions which he considers relevant and in the audience's mind about the country from whom he is asking the clarification. So the question that was put to me was that how is it that India, which is the most diverse country in the world, is able to work a democracy? I said this question itself is a very peculiar question, because democracy and diversity go together. If it is Pakistan, whether a Rahman or Ali should be the president or prime minister will be the test. All religious people, one religion, one race, one color, one language. Democracy is not needed for them. Democracy is needed where you have such unbelievable diversity. That is why we worked a democracy, and we did not work a democracy merely by methods, by votes. We had such bandwidth of acceptability and tolerance. I gave them 3 examples. That Rama obeyed his father, because of that he was revered. Prahlada defied his father, because of that he was revered. Sita obeyed her husband, so she was revered. Meera defied her husband, so she was revered. Lakshmana respected his brother, so he was respected. Vibhishana disobeyed his brother, because of that he was respected. So you must understand the bandwidth of our understanding and tolerance. This is what makes democracy workable in India. It is not votes. In fact, after the answer was over, the moderator told me this answer will be remembered for a very long time in Tokyo. It's not something which I expounded anything new. It is something which is explicit on the face of the Indian civilization. So India is emerging as the fulcrum of the democratic world, which is going to be the future world order, according to many, because the world cannot live with the dominant autocratic centers of power. So now, what is that India? An India which was always thought to be nervous about China. It has now delivered a message not only to China but to the entire world that it is unafraid of China. Not many countries today in 2017, if I remember right, the date was 30th November or so, when the Hudson Institute said that Indian Prime Minister has emerged as the only leader who could stand up to China. It was on the diplomatic stage. But it happened in Doklam. Now it is happening in Ladakh. Because we never resisted. Today, in fact, the shock of the Chinese is that why is India not afraid? Because their presumption is India will be afraid. This is the sense of Ayodhya, which has come as a result of a huge process. It has not developed in one day. And the world respects India, and India will be supported by the world. Otherwise, the world is not going to fight India's war. In fact, Jawaharlal Nehru wrote to America, please fight China for me. Nobody is going to fight your war. You have to fight your war. So, Indian ambivalence to power, which curtailed the Indian nation emerging as a player, a powerful player, has waned in the last 25-30 years. And India speaks about Atmanirbhar India. Why I am mentioning this is the foundation for all this is in the Hindu cultural and spiritual nationalism, without which this kind of evolution, unfoldment would not have taken place. It is not just political. It has unified diverse castes of India. There are caste-based political parties which have become irrelevant. There are religion-based political parties which have become almost irrelevant. There are political parties which thrived only by abusing Hinduism. They are on the defensive. This is not because of any particular political party. It is a political process which has made India stand on its own. So the Atmanirbhar idea has come in the context of economy and trade, but it is actually a cultural idea, a spiritual idea, a social idea, a national idea. That India cannot be like any other country. It can share ideas, but there cannot be one-size-fits-all model for the world. The world proclaimed in 1951, if any country has to develop, they have to give up their philosophy, they have to give up their way of life, they have to give up their caste, community, everything, and then only they are eligible for development. This was the declaration by the United Nations in 1951, an advisory for the development of underdeveloped nations. In 1990, the West declared that liberal democracy and free market have emerged as the final victor, and it is for the rest to follow the West as the best. Everything changed in 2001, and the crisis into which the global economy began getting into in the year 2005. The G20 nations declared that the one-size-fits-all model won't work. In 2008, the World Bank declared it. In 2010 to 2013, the United Nations said that it is not possible to have one-size-fits-all model. It is nonsense. This is what the United Nations said in 1951. Each nation has to work out its own model based on its culture and value systems. Democracies function like that. Governments function like that. Laws function like that. Economics will also function like that. To understand this, even now our economists, our political thinkers, our intellectuals, our civil servants, they have not understood the cultural differentials of India, which makes it apart in all spheres, including economics. So this is the realization that is coming to India. And what is the way forward? This is where I think great men like Swami Dayananda Saraswati have a big contribution to make. India was a thought giver in the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly in the 18th century. All great men said India has only the thought, philosophy, working model for a conflict-free world. It lasted even into the 19th century. But after the British established their dominion over India, this waned. And in the 20th century, India never figured. And now time has come, and in this period, India became an importer and consumer of ideas from outside. India felt that its ideas are of no relevance. In fact, Warren Hastings said, after we establish our rule, when we leave, the Indian thought system, which is so important and dominant, would have been consigned to archives. India will never go back to where it is. That's where he proved to be wrong. We have kept alive this flame. That's where great men like Swami Dayananda Saraswati, commencing from Ramakrishna Paramhansa to Vivekananda to Swami Dayananda Saraswati of Arya Samaj to Maharishi Aurobindo to Mahatma Gandhi, they all kept this flame alive. We should have been devastated in the tornado of the 20th century. And India is remanifesting. Undeniably. So, the great contribution of Swami Dayananda Saraswati, who had a global vision, global experience, global understanding, global audience, and knew how to present the Indian perspective to global, not only audience, to global mind. He and people like him, people who are inspired by him, people who are taught by him, are needed for India to emerge as a thought giver to the world, exporter of thoughts, and not as a contributor of thoughts, not as merely a consumer of thoughts. This is the next stage of development, and the world needs a civilization which has no record of violence. I want to cite to this audience the work done by Professor R.J. Ramal, and the site is called Power Kills. You must go and see that website today. He has traced human violence against human violence for the last 2,500 years. He built this site over law university professor. And he says in the world in this 2,500 years, a minimum of 680 million people and a maximum of 1.2 billion people have been killed by humans in action by humans. Till 13th century, there are only 3 instances of killing in India, according to this site. One was the Ashoka's Kalinga War. 100,000 people died. The other 2 are Satis and Thagis. In Satis and Thagis, the site says that the deaths were not even tens of thousands, which is now magnified into demonizing India. The site says it is not even tens of thousands. Even one person dying is a shame of India. But not to say that this constituted the shame of India, considering the scale of violence that was taking place elsewhere in the world. How did India avoid that violence? Such a diverse country. No single ruler, no single law, no single police, but the single thought. That made us non-violent. Just to accept the world there will be differences. That you have to live with persons whose habits you can never come to terms with. You have to live with forms of God which you will abhor. We had any number of gods. The number of gods in India were more than the number of Hindus at one point in time. We could manage with this kind of diversity. And we had the philosophy to do it. It just did not happen without a philosophy. The philosophy is that everybody is entitled to his own way of worship, of life, of eating, of dressing, of living. This is not just tolerance. as Swami Vivekananda said, this is acceptance of diversity. Tolerance of diversity is an inferior virtue. It says, your way of life is bad, but still I tolerate. So, India is now positioned to become the contributor and exporter of ideas founded on this non-conflicting values, which is founded again in our Vedanta. Mahanarayana Upanishad, in Samaveda, this Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam concept comes. It is you versus another is an inferior idea. Thousands of years back, we saw the entire world as one conceptually and lived it locally. In the same way, we saw the entire universe. Swami Dayananda Saraswati used to put it so beautifully. Isavasya Upanishad. He said everything that you see, ultimately, whether it is the cloth, whether it is the dress, whether it is the cotton, whether it is the everything, ultimately it is one. So this idea that we have to live with nature, we have to revere nature, is now a modern idea. These thoughts have to be expounded. And we need institutions, we need individuals, we need researchers for India to emerge as a contributor to the world. This will be the greatest tribute that we will be paying to one of the greatest exponents in contemporary times of ancient values, Swami Dayananda Saraswati. I'm happy that I could share this intense thoughts of mine, which connects diverse subjects and focuses on Swami Dayananda Saraswati. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sri Gurumurthy ji. This is an extraordinary exposition, starting from your interactions with Puja Swamiji and the kind of work that you did with him, and then weaving it to what his contributions were, and then looking at India and India's role in the global order, and then bringing it back to how he's thought and how he has synthesized it back, and how India can become a Vishwaguru, so to speak. I just want to, we have some time. I just want to pick up a few threads that you spoke about, especially in the last, you were talking about tolerance. I think Puja Swamiji in his Millennium Summit, Global Millennium Summit in United Nations, he spoke about this in terms of mutual respect rather than tolerance. I know you were working with him at that time. Can you share some anecdotes about that that speech? Because that speech, for probably the first time, Hindu monk, so to speak, after Swami Vivekananda spoke on a global platform. So can you share some thoughts about his speech and the contents of that?
See, Swamiji's ideas, as I said, from a Vedantin to a Vedantic nationalist. This transformation made him expound the most difficult truth, that all religions are not the same. Their goals are not the same. That is where he differentiated the aggressive religions from non-aggressive religions. And he said all religions were non-aggressive because no pre-Abrahamic religions imposed themselves on others. They lived their life. That is where he brought about this diversity of faiths meeting, in which he said all of them lived an Vedantic life, and only we had the philosophy explaining it. That's the difference. Everybody, whether it is South Americans, whether it is Africans, whether it is Asians, these millions of small communities lived in the same way. They behaved in the same way. They related to each other in the same way. They related to nature in the same way. But we only had a philosophic explanation as to why they are doing it. So that philosophy prevented Hinduism being called animistic. They could not dismiss Hinduism as animistic because we had a philosophy. We did not stop with merely worshipping a tree. Isavasamidam sarvam. We had an explanation for them. This was Swamiji's greatest contribution. Why India should emerge as a thought giver to the world is to make the people, in fact, he used to use the word, we have to validate them through our philosophy. Otherwise, they are called animes, they are called backward, they are called living in wrong times. So this powerful and original and innovative spiritual intellectualism was a remarkable contribution of Swamiji. And not one could dispute it. The most important thing is, not one could dispute it. So I think in your study, Indic Academy, this particular aspect you must produce a document as to how important it is, because everywhere now pagan religions are coming up. In fact, the British Prime Minister even said we need pagan gods. We need Roman gods. Because the world is getting bored with one God. Because you can never formalize spirituality. You can never homogenize a diverse world. And now it is that turn which is important.
Tirumurtiji, in terms of what Adi Shankaracharya has done in his time, in terms of synthesizing the different forms of worship and synthesizing and establishing the sports centers, and what the same strands I see in what Pujya Swamiji has done in terms of trying to, probably for the first time in the contemporary times, forming this Hindu Dharma Acharya Sabha, actually going to individually to all the Mathadipatis and bringing them together. A lot of people complain that the Mathadipatis are not in tune with the attacks on our Dharma. They're insular, they look within, and they're not responding to the attacks on Dharma. And what Pujya Swamiji has done for the first time is to synthesize this and bring them all together. How do you see the role of a Mathadipati when there are attacks on our Dharma? What should he or she do about that?
It is essentially because Hinduism did not postulate theological enemy. In fact, Hinduism, many people say Hindus are not united. I said unity calls for enmity. And unity is power. And Hindus did not have power because they believed in harmony rather than unity. So, Hinduism actually needs a state to defend it. No other religion needs a state to defend it. But it is the state which orphaned Hinduism here. That we survived this long goes to show that it is so rooted that it could revive. Though its leaves had fallen, it had virtually become a dry and barren tree, its roots regenerated it. Otherwise, everybody thought it is a gone case. That is essentially because of the great work done by great masters. So the foundation and the roots were so strong that it could revive. So Swami Vivekananda said, the Roman eagle floated over everything in this world. The earth trembled at the sound of the Greek army. But spider weaves its web where the Caesars ruled. This is what power ultimately. You build physical power, and when power goes, there is nothing to look for. But we lacked the physical power. There is no doubt about it. Even today, we cannot bring a unified, a Vaticanized power because your philosophy doesn't allow it. It doesn't postulate an enemy. It doesn't say there is only one. The one that you think about is when you evolve beyond the forms. That is an individual journey. There is no collective journey towards Brahman. So we have basic difficulties in forging the kind of unity which is needed to face other religions which are unified on the basis that there is an enemy to handle. They have a global agenda. You don't have a global agenda. You have an agenda for the world. You don't have an agenda against others to dominate the world. So these are all the limitations, but these are all the strengths also. So my feeling is it will take time because even these sampradayas, when they are facing difficulties to their own discipline, their own value system, their own tradition, their own way of life, then they will understand it is necessary to work with others to preserve their own traditions. It is not that X is going to harm your traditions. But unless X, Y, Z come together, their respective traditions will be in danger, is the message that has to be given to them. And that will be the responsibility of the Acharya Sabha. And I think in the 4 or 5 meets I have attended, that is the focus.
I remember working with you in the 90s and early 2000 on how seeing you closely when you worked on Swadeshi Jagran Manch, and you were very unpopular at the time because everybody was focused on globalization, and now with what has happened today. Your stand sort of is vindicated in terms of what the excesses of globalization and now how the world is moving towards deglobalizing and going inward. I'm sure you're not the kind of person who has this "I told you so" attitude. You're a humble person. But what are your reflections of that journey from having warned all of us about the ill effects of this fast rising globalization? And now we are seeing how the world is saying yes. So how do you feel, and is there a SJM version 2 that after seeing all these things, do you see a new thought emerging from you?
See, in fact, in Hyderabad only, the Administrative Staff College of India, when I delivered a lecture, it's a very big audience. One person stood up and said, people like you should be shot dead because you are preventing the progress of India. That was the extent of hostility I faced at that time. But you know what gave me the strength or two? One, I took a travel across India, from Ludhiana to Batala to Rajkot to Jamnagar to Morbi. It was the most educative experience I had. And I found that the Indian society is not individualistic, it is community oriented, it is caste oriented. They work together. There is a collective unincorporated companies. Tirupur is an unincorporated company of the Gounder community which put up the best, one of the best export shows in India. Is 67% of the people educated less than 10th standard becoming entrepreneurs. And making it a knitwear export center. The same I saw how Ludhiana became one of the largest cycle manufacturing centers in the world, and how Ludhiana was exporting cycle spare parts to all the multinational cycle manufacturers. It is because of a community called Ramgarhia community, which could understand and operate technology. It established a machine tools factory. And it is now one of the largest centers of motorcycle manufacturing. How did this come? It did not come because of any university or engineering college. I saw the same thing in, which is the place with the biggest, with the highest per capita income in India. It's not any of these great cities and metropolitan towns. It is a place called Morbi, Gujarat. So this gave me a fundamental different perception that the formal understanding of India is wrong. India is basically civilizational in economics also. It is not individualistic. There is family, community, society working on civilizational values, and that puts up the economic performance. Entrepreneurship is the criterion. Whichever community has taken to entrepreneurship have come up. Take Tamil Nadu, the Nadar community, the Gondar community, the Naidu community. They all come up because they took to business. Those who took to politics have all regressed because they are dependent on the state. Those who took to entrepreneurship are dependent on themselves. So all over when I saw this, I found the Indian civilization is more aligned to entrepreneurship. It is not the traditional Vaishya community. There is a huge shift of the backward class into entrepreneurship. The Patel community, the Ramgarhia community. Take any community. So I found there is a very different economics in operation and we will emerge as the winners. This perception I developed between 1992 and 2001. To 2000 when I proposed to Atal Bihari Vajpayee that we must have this cluster policy. Then only the industrial cluster policy can to promote those clusters which have come up on their own without government support. There are 2,800 artisan clusters in India and 350 active industrial clusters, which constitute 60% of India's production and exports and as much industrial employment. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, I saw history, how the shelf life of ideas are crashing. Colonialism lasted for 200 years. At that time, everybody thought that was going to be the permanent feature of the world. Then mercantile capitalism came. Everybody thought that was going to be the future of the world. It lasted for 100 years. Communism came. Everybody thought that this is going to dominate half the world. It is going to be 50 years, it was gone. Then globalization came. I thought the shelf life of all these ideas are not founded on durable values. And globalization was founded on the most compromising values, unprincipled world order. And so I thought, unless there is a world government, there cannot be a world economic order. That is why I thought, in fact, I said in 1995, globalization will collapse and WTO will become irrelevant. In those days when I spoke, it was not based on any intuition or anything. It was based on how the shelf life of ideas which were being promoted by a materialistic world, which is not rooted in something permanent, is going to be an unstable world.
Yes, I remember. In fact, Kishore has also joined us, and those days we remember. And you were actually
organized meetings for me.
Yes, yes, and those were very. You were actually going against the wind or the popular speak. I have one more question on the narrative. We are in power for the last 6 years now, and when I say we, the people on the right or the conservative or the non-left side, but we are not really controlling the narrative. And the narrative is completely with the left and the Marxists and all those people. And so political power is there, but the narrative is completely in their hands. And we've seen this growing more and more in what's happening in the West. And we see the impact on that here also. Do you think at any point in time, in foreseeable future, do you think there would be a time when the narrative balance will be in our favor? The way things...
narratives don't change a nation. The narratives reflect a nation. Today, the narrative does not reflect the nation.
Yes.
So, the true narrative will come when this narrative ceases to be relevant. Is communism a relevant narrative today? It was so relevant, so dominant, so powerful. It's gone. So, what is called as narrative is only a manifestation of what a nation or people are. There is a complete divorce between the existing narrative and the existing ecosystem. So this ecosystem will manifest, because when what you say becomes irrelevant, then that narrative will become irrelevant. So this is a change, if you want to know whether the narratives have changed in the country, narratives can distort a country, can distort one's mind. It can never constitute a durable change. Because if you look at the narrative of India in the last 70 years, narratives have only distorted India. They have not directed India. India has directed itself. That is it is the one Ram Temple movement has been able to bring the reality of India into a shape which no narrative could have done that, because it is rooted in the Indian soil, Indian people, in their mind, in their history, in their civilization, in their belief systems. Your narrative may deny it, the narrative may try to invalidate it, delegitimize it. It's not going to happen. So I am, of course, the narratives control day-to-day situation, but it is not going to be more useful than that. It is bound to change. It will change over a period.
We have a few questions. I'll just go through it and then we can wind up. Oh. Yeah, most of them are just compliments. So I think we'll wind up.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was just an extraordinary evening, sharing thoughts about Pujya Swamiji and connecting over Pujya Swamiji and understanding. I really like the way you brought in the importance of Ayodhya. I think that for me is the biggest takeaway of the pivot that Ayodhya played in the post-70 thing. And in terms of not internally for all of us, but the role of Ayodhya globally and how people now perceive India just with that event. And I never looked at it from that perspective. I only looked at it as a civilizational man and somebody who was very happy. And yes, thank you so much, Gurumati ji. Thank you once again. It's been an extraordinary event. And this is no other way, the best way for me and for all of us to pay gratitude to Pujya Swamiji and all that he has done. I'm so glad that we are connected through Pujya Swamiji and he lives through our actions. Thank you. Thank you.